Okay, hello everybody. I haven't made a video in a while. Not exactly in the most suitable place to actually make a video. Hope none of my housemates actually walk in and think I'm talking to myself. Yeah, bit awkward. But anyway, I wanted to review a history book I read last year. It's had a profound impact on me. This helped my novel actually quite a bit. It's called The Borgias, A Hidden History. No, sorry, The Borgias, The Hidden History by G.J. Mayer, who also wrote the Tudors, The Complete History of England's Most Notorious Dynasty, which I haven't actually read yet. This Borgia book is more recent book by Mayer. It follows, as the name implies, the infamous Borgia family of Spanish descent who were dominant in Italy, in particular the Vatican, and its surrounding areas, and from around at the mid the mid 15th century to the early 16th century. They're known as one of the most infamous families in Europe. Known as one of the most infamous families in Europe, but as G.J. Mayer explores, they possibly don't deserve this largely posthumous title. Actually, it seems that they were relatively less ruthless than some of their contemporaries, or at worst just as ruthless, but no more ruthless than a lot of their contemporaries. There's lots of myths around the Borgias, like Cesare and Lucrezia Borgias, the siblings, the parent children of Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, the patriarch of the family. They apparently had an incestuous relationship. G.J. Mayer points out there's no real evidence for stuff like that. He also goes as far as to suggest that Cesare, Lucrezia, Juan, and Giuffre weren't actually Rodrigo's children, like most believe. They were actually his nephews, and that they were actually probably Rodrigo's elder brother Pedro Luis's children. G.J. Mayer does not provide claims for this. The book is very revisionist, and that's kind of a danger, because when you're talking about revisionist history, it really is the onus of the author to back up what he or she is saying. Obviously, I apologise for bringing up Goodwin's Law, but obviously the main concern about revisionist history is you could use it to kind of explain away or try and apologise for anything. I mean, like, well, did the Holocaust actually happen to the extent it happened, if you're going to go down this line of thought? Well, I would argue that revisionist history is okay to an extent. There's a difference between trying to look at the Borgias in a more rational and objective light than there is to denying the Holocaust. Because even if you take the Borgias at the most black and white cartoon villainy that they were apparently guilty of, they were still nowhere near as vindictive and cruel as, well, the Nazis. So, I mean, they didn't commit systematic genocide, and they didn't start a world war, so it's kind of, they're different arguments, really. But I mean, who are the Borgias? Well, the book tries to go into this. It starts with detailing the backdrop to kind of Vatican politics in the 15th century. It does a pretty good job of this. Goes into the first Borgia pope, Alphonse de Borgia, or Calixtus III, who ruled from 1455 to 1458. points out that he was actually a pretty enlightened Pope, at least for the time. He was tolerant and he was committed to working, even though when he actually became Pope he was 80 years old. Actually, that was the reason he was chosen as Pope, because it was believed he would die soon. He was only Pope for like 3 years, so he kind of lived up to that prediction. The author does admit that Calixtus was guilty of nepotism. He advanced Rodrigo Borgia into becoming the Vice Chancellor of the Vatican. Basically, if the Pope is, since the Pope was basically a monarch, he would be the king, the Vice Chancellor would be the Prime Minister, so Rodrigo was the Vice Chancellor of the Vatican, starting from around 1458 up until he was elected as Pope, basically. So yeah. It points out Rodrigo was conscientious Vice Chancellor, apart from a scandal that happened in the reign of Pope Pius, Calixtus's successor. Successor. So it's, but then again, the author goes into the sources and he points out that the scandals, well, they're kind of ambiguous in nature. The Borgias apparently attempted mass poisonings, but there's no actual evidence of such mass poisonings. I mean, one thing the author points out that's very interesting is the Pope Alexander's death in 1503. Apparently, he was at a banquet with Cesare and other cardinals, and according to anti-Borgia rumour, he wanted to poison some of the cardinals, but him and Cesare botched the plan, so he ended up drinking the poison himself unintentionally. But the author is quick to point out that if the Borgias were such sinister poisoners and had been doing it for decades, like their enemies had been alleging that they had, then it's kind of odd that they would screw up this plan so badly to the point where Rodrigo or Alexander himself would actually be poisoned. It's more likely that he actually died of sickness, since there was a nasty summer drought at the time, which also kind of killed off Calixtus III. I'll get to say that name right eventually by the end of this review. In 1458. This summer drought made a lot of people sick in 1503, and Rodrigo was old at that stage, so it's probably more logical that he fell ill to that more than any botched attempt at political intrigue and poisoning. So it's also stuff is mentioned, like Rodrigo allowed Jews to come into Rome who were being persecuted in Catholic Spain by Isabella and Ferdinand. I will be speaking more about Isabella in another video when I review the book Isabella the Warrior Queen, which I'm currently reading. It has some interesting overlaps with this book, and it itself falls into some slight historical revisionism, although interestingly enough it portrays the Borgias as kind of over-the-top cartoon villains, the usual portrayal of them, but the Borgia book kind of portrays Isabella and Ferdinand in a negative light, so which is quite interesting actually if you think about it. It's like, so which of them is true? Or are they both exaggerations? It's hard to tell. Is there flaws with the book? Definitely. As I said, the onus is on the author of the revisionist history to actually prove what he or she is saying. And a lot of the author's claims, like that Cesare, Lucrezia, Juan, and Jouffre weren't actually Alexander's children, he doesn't really back it up. He does look at some sources, and he points out that like several popes referred to people they were addressing in letters as my beloved son or my beloved daughter. That's a valid argument, but I mean, he fails to account why Rodrigo took such an interest in these four individuals in particular, and he appointed them to such high positions. He even started emptying the Vatican treasury to support Cesare's military adventures around the Papal States, something the author doesn't even try to deny. So, although he does do a pretty good job of pointing out that the warlords Cesare were fighting against were actually more vindictive and bloodthirsty than he was any day. Cesare seems to have actually imposed just policies on the cities he conquered, and would have been interesting to see what would have happened if he had lived a bit longer. But he kind of collapsed from from the pinnacle he was at after Pope Alexander died in 1503. So yeah, not going to get into the whole book now. Obviously, as kind of an agnostic who isn't exactly affectionate about organised religion, and kind of opposed to Pope Alexander VI and popes in general, so the institution of the Roman Catholic Church and other religions in general. So, but from a secular political viewpoint, which you could basically see the Pope and a lot of the popes following him and going before him as, he doesn't seem to have been that bad. He ended a lot of the conflicts between the different papal states. He brought ruthless warlords like the Orsini clan and the Colonni to heel, which pissed both of them off. They were, it's worth noting, two of the Borgias' most bitter enemies, and they're never portrayed as ruthless for some reason, even though the Orsini in particular seem to have been actually quite nasty. I mean, one of the reasons the Borgias were hated is because they were from Spain. Not because of anything they did. Calixtus was called the barbarian pope, not because he was a barbarian, but because he wasn't Roman. So that was, I mean, so yeah, the book is kind of told it goes into the background of each event, then it goes in a chronological order, but it switches between them to go a few decades back, so that you can see why the thing happened and you can get the full context of the event. So the author does a good job of not just telling the Borgia history, but actually explaining the world the Borgias lived in and how that might have affected their policies. He also discusses some of the secondary and primary sources, like he points out, I think it was the 1960s, it wasn't until the 1960s that an academic actually wrote a paper questioning all the myths about the Borgias that we have come to kind of accept as truth. So it's not, and he points out that nobody has done any really serious scholarly work to actually try and find out if these myths are actually stand up on their own two feet. And from the evidence he presents in the book, I would agree with him. I would agree with I would agree with him. The Borgias were guilty of nepotism, especially Alexander VI. But all the popes were guilty of nepotism. They definitely were ruthless. They used the Vatican army to try and conquer territory, but a lot of the previous popes did that as well. It's not. Um, then there was the whole incident of Savonarola, the militant, the militant priest from Florence. Yes, Florence. Uh, the author does try to justify that by saying Savonarola had gone insane by the time the Borgias moved against him. He wasn't. Originally, he was acting out of democratic principles and trying to create a republican Florence, but he then started to believe he heard God's voice inside his head, which is always kind of a danger. And so the Borgias needed to act against. When I say the Borgias, I mean Pope Alexander VI needed to act against him. Um, So yeah, there's also things. Cesare apparently reportedly murdered his brother Juan Borgia, but the author points out quite clearly that there is no evidence of this, and Cesare may not even have been in Rome at the time of the murder. So, he leaves it as an open question, but there's no way to prove it. It's speculation. It seems to be part of the Borgia myth that if something bad happened in between the years 1455 and 1507, and the Borgia was probably responsible for it, whether or not they were actually likely to be responsible for it. Um, so, where does this leave us? Well, I would say it is a good book. Definitely not without its flaws. Some of the claims are contentious, like that Cesare Lucrezia won and Giuffre weren't the Pope's natural children, but they were just his nephews. And he doesn't do a completely satisfying job, in my view, of arguing that Cesare and Lucrezia weren't involved in an incestuous relationship, although admittedly the evidence does seem vague, so I think again that's kind of a question we're never actually going to have an answer to, so it's kind of a 50-50 toss-up. He does do a good job of showing that Lucrezia was actually granted governorship of a city, and she actually ruled justly, and the people liked her, so, which is a bit odd considering the fact she's meant to be a sociopathic poisoner, serial poisoner. Yeah. A lot of the sources, it's also worth pointing out, were written during the reign of Pope Julian, or Giuliano della Rovere, one of Rodrigo Borgia's mortal enemies, who became Pope shortly after the latter died in 1503. It was this man who had convinced King Charles VIII of France to launch an invasion of Italy, which is kind of a bloodthirsty thing to do, if you think, so that he could try and dethrone Alexander from the throne of St. Peter. Alexander actually gave a good account of himself during that invasion. He stayed in Rome and refused to leave, even when the French army were on the doorstep of the Vatican. But it was a lot of the anti-Borgia pamphlets and stories came out when this guy became the Vicar of Christ. So, make of that what you want. Does that mean he was he acting on sources of the time that he knew, or was he following his own bitter political agenda against this family he despised? he was an extremely ambitious man, and one of his relatives, Francesco, I think Francesco della Rovere, had been Pope prior to that. I think he was Pope Sixtus, the Pope before Alexander VI. So it was in his interest to actually frame the Borgias, but that doesn't mean he didn't hypocritically use them as well to help gain his election at the conclave. He promised Cesare Borgia continued support for his conquests in the Vatican States, and his dream of seemingly uniting all of Italy under his own rule as a Caesar. So yeah, Julian apparently didn't hate the Borgias enough to actually need their support for the conclave. But then when he actually became Pope, he disowned Cesare and he cut off his financial funds that his father had been, his uncle, quotation marks, or father, had been sending him throughout his papacy. This eventually led Cesare, of course, to lose his army, and he fled to what was becoming unified Spain and Aragon and Castile, which I'll be talking about more in my review of the Isabella book, until he was killed in battle, or else he committed suicide, charging into battle deliberately when he knew he would die in 1507. But so, my point is, it's all complicated. I personally don't think the Borgias were any more ruthless than anyone else back then. They definitely weren't. They definitely weren't completely moral. That's true, but nobody then was completely moral. I mean, it is interesting that Giuliano della Rovere doesn't receive criticism for encouraging France to invade Italy, but Rodrigo Borgia is considered this demonic monster when he actually heroically stood up to the French invasion, and he actually also saved Jews from persecution in Spain. But it's been, sometimes I think that I think it's important to read historical revisionism so we can ask questions like that. Why are things like this? Why are things considered in this manner? And that's about it. I would definitely recommend the book, The Borgias, The Hidden History by G.J. Mayer. It's quite a long read, around 500 pages, but it's definitely worth it. It doesn't just take the sources at face value. It tries to actually discuss what happened, even if sometimes it doesn't back up its claims with the strongest evidence. It's a thought-provoking read, and what more can a book do if not cause you to think? Okay, that's about it. As I said, next I will be reviewing Isabella the Warrior Queen, a biography of Isabella of Castile, and her rise to power. And as I said, that book has some overlap with this time period in the Borgia period. So yeah. I would definitely recommend this book. G.J. Mayer's book. I will get to reviewing Isabella soon. I need to finish reading it, which I hope to do soon. And I'm going to do some historical fiction, Morris Droon's The Accursed King series. Oh boy. But maybe I'll actually do some stuff I like before that, like Hilary Mantel's Place of Greater Safety, best historical fictional novel ever, if not one of the best novels ever. Okay, that's about it. Goodbye.